it's finally changed too.
It's no longer 1955. And what we're finding when we start to work with churches is they're still using 1955 techniques, methods, and measuring sticks to try to do something in 2013. So again, we're not unaware or insensitive to what you pastors are facing when you go into a church and what the culture of that church and how it looks at it and how it expects you to do it and move. You know, one of the things, oops, there we go. Now, just to give you a little understanding of this, 70% of these people on the screen right here, between the ages of 18 and 22, drop out of the church, never to return. Never. They don't return to the non-denominational churches. They don't return to their own church. They do not return. That's what we're facing. So you begin to kind of see these kind of things, and part of it is just understanding that. Now, when we tried to, when I got together with my associates, and we tried to come up with a word that would describe the church's relationship to the culture today, the word that we came up with was isolation. We debated about whether it should be irrelevant, and we stopped at that because we found that most churches are isolated, and this is how the culture looks at them. Something as ancient and as foreboding as a castle. Well, I had one lady during my workshop she said, well, that's not a Methodist church. Okay, now it's a Methodist church. In 1955, this is not how a church looked at to people in the culture. But this is how a church appears to a culture today. Now, I know you might have a more modern-looking building and you got one of those flashy signs, but for the people driving by it, that's how it looks. Isolated. And they're isolated from it. Not only has the church isolated itself, but the culture is isolating itself from the church. So it almost begins to get insurmountable. So the idea of waiting for people, to come is even worse. So I want to put this in perspective for you. When we talk about the church, pastors, I know you got that office and it's a to die for office. But you have to understand the context in which that is. Now, when I started working with New Start pastors, one of the first things that we had to cure them of was the need for an office. Because there's absolutely no relationship between having an office and adding one new person to your church, let alone a church plant. And even worse, there's absolutely no relationship between having an office and one new profession of faith. And so we began to talk with them about, you don't need an office. Your office is out there. Get out into the mission field. And so we began to talk like this. Now, what was so amazing to me is when these churches would invite me in to talk about how they would grow numerically, I would sit down, and the first thing they would do, Bishop, is brag on how hard of a worker their pastor was. They would say, our pastor is such a hard worker. They would go on and on and on. I'd say, well, how do you know your pastor's such a hard worker? Well, because our pastor's always in the office. Gotcha. See. Now, I want to just help you understand. That's 2013 response. In 1955, that wasn't the answer of lay people in any church in our country. In 1955, the pastor of a United Methodist Church and any other pastor in that community, on Monday, they were at the Kiwanis Club luncheon. On Tuesday, they were at the Lions Club. On Wednesday, they were at the Chamber of Commerce. On Thursday, they were at the Country Club. And on Friday, they were home working on their sermon. But every church in this country, didn't matter what denomination, saw their pastor as the face of the church to the community. And what's happened over the last 60 years is we've gradually reeled in our pastors and sat them in an office and say, okay, grow the church numerically. Do you see what we've gotten into? We are now almost at a fourth generation of pastors who received absolutely no training in Bible college or seminary or any other place as to how to go out into the community. When I talk with the young pastors today about networking, they think I'm talking about setting up their Wi-Fi in the internet. And so this is the thing that we have seen, and we have discovered that not only has the church become isolated from the community. Many pastors are isolated from their community. Now, this, as someone, now remember, you're talking to someone who's done over 2,000 assessments and credentialing of clergy in our country. So one of the things that has always impressed me, particularly among the Methodists, is when I assess clergy for the Methodists, what stands out so much is they rate so high on their people side, on the people skill side, on hanging out with people. In fact, most of you in the room, the primary reason that you entered into a call for ministry is you love people. You like hanging out with them, you like nurturing them, you like walking through the dark times, you like the happy times, but you like people, and you got involved to be with people. I'm preaching now, I need to calm down, I'm sorry. But that's why we got into this, is to be with people, to help them in some way, shape, or form navigate through this smoke of life and follow the discipleship path that Christ has given to us. That's why we got into this thing. And so most pastors are an asset to their church. And what do we do with them? Put them in an office. And we know that for most of you, 95% of the people you interact with are the same 10 to 15 people every single week. And there's no relationship between that and being healthy, by the way. And there's absolutely no relationship between that and adding new people to your church. That's the amazing thing to me, is in the assessment, is that there are so many good clergy. And what we do is we take our best asset, the face to the community, and put them in an office. And then we affirm them. Pastor, oh, it was so good. You know, I drove by the church the other night, 9:30, and the pastor's car was still there. Wow, what a hard worker. Well, my experience is that the working happens outside the office. See, I'm not impressed with any pastor who's sitting in an office because there's not a whole lot that they're doing in there. The work is out there. I think it was somebody said, the world is my parish, last time I checked. And one of the things that when we go in and work with a church, one of the things that we ask them to do is that the SPRC actually has to vote and set aside and say, we expect our pastor to spend X amount of time networking in the community every week. And at the SPRC meeting, at their monthly SPRC meeting, the pastor, the first order of business is the pastor giving an account for the time and what they've done. Now, when they're out in the community, they're not playing. They're working. Some of you were second career. You had a background in sales of some kind, interacting with the public. You know you did very few sales over the phone. You made some contacts maybe, but you closed because you got involved with people. We like to say ministry is a contact sport. And we've forgotten that because the only place we get affirmed is for being in the office. You're a hard worker, you're sitting in the office. And one of the things that we learned to do was manage a church office. In fact, most of you had seminary professors who told you, you don't have to go and get the people. The church members will bring all the people. Well, see, this is what you learned how to do. Manage that office. The church members, they're going to bring in all the new people. Well, as Dr. Phil likes to ask, how's that been working for you lately? Because you have to understand, your church members are a fourth generation of United Methodists that have absolutely no invitation at all in their system. Most of them have never been a part of a church that grew by people inviting someone and bringing them on their elbow. There are some church planters here in the room. That's the only way they could grow their church. See, so one of the things that we found out is the rules have changed. And many of you clergy are aware of that the attract model just no longer works. It's the invite model that we begin to look at and we begin to talk through. So as churches are declining and doing that, they want new people, and you've got to get out and you've got to knock on some doors. Okay, let me just get going. See, this is, men and women, this is what we were designed for right here. Interaction. Ministry is a contact sport, being with people. That's why we got into it. But not the same 10 to 15 to 20 people every single week, all along. All right, so I want to talk to you about how you kind of release things. Oh, this is one of my favorites right here. In 2006, church growth consultant Win Arn took a survey of 5,000 Christians around the country, and there were 5 or 6. They had one question that says, what is the purpose of your church? Why does your church exist? And there were 6 answers given, and one of the answers was, the church exists for my needs and the needs of my family. Wow. 88% of the Christians checked that box. So pastors, I'm not insensitive or unaware of the culture and the mindset that you're facing. In fact, when I started churches, the hardest group of people to reach were church people who had relocated to the area I was starting a church. And they would show up at the door, Bishop, and they would say, what do you have for my 2-year-old, my 10-year-old, my teenager, and my elderly grandmother living with us? And when I talk with most existing church pastors, I said, what's one of your greatest fantasies? And they go, Jim, one of my greatest fantasies is when I'm out in the foyer after the service and greeting people coming out of the sanctuary, that a new family would come up and say, hi, we're the Smiths from Sacramento. Where can we serve? That's a fantasy that pastors have. Now, don't look so pious. Is he the only one that has that fantasy? Can I get an amen? I'm going to turn this whole crowd into a deacon's bench here in a minute. I'm feeling kind of lonely up here. I need some feedback. All right, so this is what you're facing, and it's our contention that when you're facing this, the church didn't get into this problem overnight, and it's not going to get out of this problem overnight. So I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes about what we find is the clergy's role. The lay people have a role, but it's different from the minister's role. So if you're serving a church in whatever credentialed capacity you're in, we find that this works all across the board. But we find also that this is what you're facing as you begin to look at these kinds of things. And so there's a steep, not a steep decline, but just a gradual numerical decline in the church. And I know that they have all kinds of church surveys you can take, the new church, the NCD, all these kinds of surveys to find out about your church. Well, we just did a workshop for 10 churches that had gone through all these, and they called up and said, we'd like you to come and help us get some people. I go, well, I thought you went through this survey. Oh, yeah, we did that 3 years. We had retreats. We went to the resorts. We heard from God, and we looked at our belly button, and we just said, okay. And they did all this survey. It's all inward focused. And at the end of those 3 years, they hadn't added one new person. Now, friends, that's not revitalization. That's just recirculating the people in the same thing. You're all still breathing the same air, drinking from the same tap, and in the same bubble. The church didn't get into that quickly. It's not going to get out quickly. But it's our conviction that it's the role of the pastor, the chief shepherd of the local church. It's the role of the pastor to lead the church back into the mission field. And if the pastor's not doing it, it's not going to happen. Will not happen, won't happen, can't get it to happen. Even with therapy, it's not going to happen. See, so pastors, when I start talking about this, many pastors start twitching because this is new territory. How many of you had a course in Bible college or seminar on how to network in your community? Okay? Large group, we got 5 or 6 hands up. So I'm not insensitive or unaware of the fact that you've had little or no training in this. And I was also reticent to talk about this topic because when I talk about this topic here, in our workshops, 6 of the lay leaders are around the table with their pastor to hear what I'm talking about. Because it's important that the lay people and pastors interact about this. So I'm just kind of sowing a few seeds today in terms of how this works. This afternoon, my wife Kim is training the 89 United Methodist church planters at the boot camp in Dallas. I'm going to get on a plane 6 o'clock tomorrow morning and fly back and finish the training. But she's talking to them this afternoon about networking. And because networking for church planters is so important, we say depending on the population size of an area and the population density, it's our expectation that a church planter in the first 2 years that they make 10,000 contacts. 10,000, you heard it right, 10,000. Now, I had one church planter said, well, if I go to a Sooner Longhorn football game, does that count? And I said, well, then yours is 1 million. See, but 10,000. Now, those aren't necessarily individual contacts, but they have to make contacts. When we work with existing church pastors, we basically say, we say, you need to spend 20% of your time outside of the office networking in your community. 20%. Now, I'm very liberal in my 20%. I'm assuming that you only have a 40-hour work week, which we know is a joke. So based on a 40-hour work week, that means 8 hours a week, each one of you in this room, whether you're part-time or full-time, you would spend 20% of your time out in the community networking. Now, when I say this, please understand and write this down. This is not on your time. This is on church time. This is on church time. You can see now why you need lay people sitting next to you to hear this. See, because anytime your car is not parked in front of that church office and your light isn't on, your people assume you're playing somewhere and you're lazy. Now, this, I take great offense to that kind of observation, because I have coached now over 1,200 pastors around the country. And almost to a person, the thing that stands out about most pastors is they have such a strong work ethic. They take pride in their work, and they work hard. They work overtime. Nobody sees the behind-the-scenes things that you men and women do day in and day out. It's hard work. You put up with a lot of nonsense. You have to put up with a lot of the nastiness. You have to hear people spew all their sins all over you as they talk about it. You have to put up with all that kind of stuff. And you come back for more. The work ethic of most pastors has just been a privilege for me to know them, to see them, and to interact with them. So for lay people to assume that their pastor, when they're not in the office, is out playing is unbelievable to me. But this is how the culture has gotten, and we've got to say no more. No boss, and move forward on that. And pastors, for this to happen, you're going to have to begin to negotiate getting out back into the community and showing the fruit of that. And I wouldn't be asking you to do this if I hadn't seen this happen now hundreds and hundreds of times around the connection as we work with church planters and existing church pastors of small congregations as they begin to lead them back into the mission field and new professions or reactivated professions of faith in Jesus Christ by the adults that they interact with. All of whom would say, if this pastor had not come to me, I would not be here. We rarely ever hear of somebody say, I was in the doctor's office and I saw the church brochure. Whoa. I've just never met anybody like that. I've already been on 122 aircraft this year. And when you do that for 15 or 20 years like I have, you have a lot of conversations with people. And it's hilarious. I get on a plane, and back when I was a pastor, I'd get on the plane, I'd sit next to a business person, and they'd be drinking, knocking down shots and telling me nasty jokes and things, and then they'd say, "What do you do?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm a minister." Oh, well, then they'd apologize for their jokes and kind of move the drink over. Now, when I sit on a plane, they're doing the same thing, and they go, "What do you do?" And I go, "Well, I used to be a minister." Oh, man, you can just see them begin to think in their mind, "Man, I'm sitting next to a real sinner now. This guy's, holy smokes." So now they buy me drinks and tell me more jokes. See? And so it'll come around to church. Ultimately, it comes around to church. I'll say, "Do you have a church background, or do you attend a church now?" And every once in a while, I'll always get an earful, but every once in a while I'll have somebody say, "Well, yeah, my family, we've just been back to church for a couple years." And I'll ask them, "What brought you back to the church?" And not one time have they said, "The brochure." What did they tell me? I had a neighbor. I had a business associate. I had a cousin. I had somebody that walked across the street, stuck out their elbow, and escorted me to church. It's all about contact. Have I mentioned that ministry is a contact sport? You know that what I'd like you to do is reconnect with the feelings that you had back in those early days when you sensed that call and you began to feel the wind of God in your sails as you began to interact and work with people as you did those kinds of things. Now, when I say that, when I say to you, you're going to need to spend 20% of your time out of the office, I already know what you're thinking. See, your mind is already in chaos when you heard that, because you say, I got so much to do in my church. Well, how much time do I have? Where are we on time? I have no clue. What time? I got an hour left? Oh, man. Now, the rest of what I'm going to say, you're not going to like any of it. And, where's Craig? Craig Stinson's around here, so, I want you to like me, right? I just want all of you to like me so much, but you're not going to like anything I have to say now. It's just... And, but I can tell you that when we work with churches through this is the number one objection that I hear why pastors don't have any time and I just say, you've got to revisit how you spend your time, pastors. I know what you inherited from your predecessor at the church you're in. I'm aware of that. But if you're going to lead that church back into the mission field and you're going to network, you've got to free up. I'm not asking you to add 20% to your time. I'm asking you to address areas where you could free up 20% so you actually have the energy and the time to get back into the mission field. And this is the first place right here, pastoral care. I find that most pastors do not have a strategy for pastoral care. Their strategy is to react. Now, I've got several books in the making. I'm working on one book called The Behaviors, not the qualities or the characteristics, but the behaviors of effective pastors. Because it's not their characteristics that set them aside, it's their behaviors. And one of the things the first thing that I find when I work with effective pastors, the first thing that they do, they do not answer their phone. So I'm suggesting, when I coach pastors, one of the first things we tell them to do is turn off their phone. Now, when I say that, I don't mean put it on silent. I mean turn it off. And somehow we've forgotten, we somehow think that the phone is attached to ministry. And here's my question. In 1822, if you were a circuit rider and somebody had a crisis in your circuit, what do you think happened? Let me ask you this. Did they survive without you? See, what we've created, every pastor I meet with, you know what the first thing they tell me? I don't want to be a hospice pastor. And my response is, well, then why are you acting like one? See, a hospice pastor has the phone on all the time on 24/7 call. 24/7. And you contract with the church, you call, they come running. That's not pastoral care, that's reactional ministry. There's nothing strategic about that. I have pastors that will go, they'll spend 8 hours in the waiting room with someone, a loved one who's waiting for surgery, and call that ministry. That's not ministry, friends. And it certainly isn't pastoral care. In fact, if you ever asked them, they would tell you, I don't want you sitting here for 8 hours. You say, well, how do you know that? Because I asked the lay people. When you're there for that length of time, they got to entertain you. And then when Cousin Harry shows up, you've all encountered Cousin Harry in the waiting room, haven't you? So all I can tell you is you really want to think through pastoral care. The reacting to the phone calls. You say, well, yes, Jim, but I don't have a secretary. It's a small church. Now, I know even small churches have answering machines. See? And if you're in a small community, here's what we tell pastors to do. You turn your phone on at 8:30 in the morning and you check your voicemail. And then you turn it off. You turn it on at 11 and then you turn it off. You turn it on at 1:30 and then you turn it off. And you turn it on at 5 and then you turn it off. And you say, well, what if there's an emergency? Friends, I've never, ever seen a pastor with their phone off, out of contact. They will find you. And they don't need you immediately. They need you 3 hours later anyway. So pastoral care, where most pastors get into trouble, is the reactionary mode. See, here's the thing. You're at home on Friday working on your sermon because your people are saying, your sermons are getting a little on the light side. We need some deep stuff. We want some, steak and potatoes this Sunday. So you're working on your sermon, you're working through the text, you're praying, you're thinking about these things, and now your phone rings. See? And you answer it. And it's somebody wanting to know Joe's email address, which is what most calls to ministers are 411 calls. They're not calls that have anything to do with pastoral care. And so that's what happens. Now, pastors, how easy is it for you to go back to that? You cannot recapture that train of thought that you were in, that you'd had going for 3 hours. You can't just kind of unplug and then plug back in. Now you're into, okay, now what was that? And now you're wondering, oh gosh, she sounded a little upset. Or maybe I should call her back. I mean, you just go on and on and on. And no wonder when you get up on Sunday morning, the people get leftovers. You cannot afford to give the people of God leftovers. And if you're going to give them leftovers, this is what hospice pastors do, because they're in a reaction mode. If you're going to set aside times, put on your phone on the voicemail, I'm in study and preparation for the sermon on Sunday. And you put it on there for 12 hours on that day. You need to begin to send signal to your people that they are adults. And if they need you, they can find you. But most of the needs we find have no relationship to pastoral care. So, there's that piece of it. What we find is most churches, the pastor does 85% of the pastoral care. And in our model, 15% of the time you should be spending on pastoral care. Now, I wish I had a little thing to write on here, because I'd show you. But the last church I started, most of the churches I started, we reached younger people first. Because our motto was about the music, if it's too loud, you're too old. See, and so we did that. But as we grew, a lot of the grandkids started to bring their grandparents to the church, and before you know it, I must have had 70 or 80 retired people in our church. And I wanted to minister to them. Well, if you follow the old-fashioned way, you visit them one at a time, which is what most of your people expect you to do. And I said, well, first of all, this is not productive, and how do you visit this many people and have a relationship with them? In fact, you don't. And most of you, what's going to happen for you, the only time you actually visit